Eliminate humanity, the Galactic Council ordered it. Earth's quiet response came first. A Galactic Council in closed session. One vote. One species on trial. The chamber had no windows. That was by design. The Galactic Deliberative Council, a body representing 41 recognized civilizations across 6 stellar clusters, had constructed its primary assembly hall deep within the core of a decommissioned generation ship orbiting the red dwarf Cara Secundus. No natural light. No sense of day or night. Only the steady blue-white glow of bioluminescent panels lining a room wide enough to swallow a city block, and the hum of translation matrices converting 7 dozen languages into coherent thought. The session had been classified from the moment it was called. Delegate Vorisen of the Ket Ascendancy was the first to formally table the motion. She was a careful being, measured in her words, precise in her legal frameworks, and widely regarded across the council as neither cruel nor impulsive. That made what she said all the more difficult to ignore. The species designated Homo sapiens, she began, her translated voice landing flat and clinical in the chamber's acoustic dampening field, represents an active threat profile unlike anything catalogued in council records going back 400,000 cycles. No one interrupted. In the span of a single planetary century, a fraction of a blink in galactic time, this species has achieved interstellar transit, established 17 extrasolar research installations, reverse-engineered Tier 3 propulsion from salvaged wreckage, and demonstrated offensive military capacity exceeding projections by a factor of 11. She paused. We did not plan for them. That sentence carried weight. The Council had contingency frameworks for nearly every developmental pathway a pre-contact species might take. Slow growth, cultural stagnation, self-extinction through resource collapse or warfare. Even the rare aggressive expanders, civilizations that reached the stars hungry and territorial, were anticipated, catalogued, and managed through standard containment protocols. But humanity had not followed any known path. They had not been guided. They had not been invited. They had not stumbled onto alien technology through lucky archaeological discovery, as roughly 40% of spacefaring civilizations had. They had simply built, crashed, rebuilt, failed in ways that should have ended them and then gotten back up. The Ket Ascendancy's threat assessment model had flagged Earth 14 years prior to this session. At that point, humanity's fastest spacecraft topped out at roughly 4% of light speed, and their understanding of quantum field manipulation was theoretical at best. The model had assigned a low-level monitoring tier. 18 months later, a human research team at the Ganymede Deep Array had recorded what appeared to be a stable microfold event. 6 months after that, the first human vessel crossed beyond the heliopause under modified gravity compression drive. The Council had watched, debated, assigned committees, requested additional sensor data, held 3 preparatory sessions. And in all that careful deliberation, humanity had gone from a watched species to a present one, showing up at the edge of explored space with instruments that could see things the Council would have preferred remained unseen. The motion before this body, Vorisen continued, is not punitive. It is preemptive. It is a risk calculus. A secondary delegate, Phoros of the Thaline Collective, a civilization 3,000 years older than Earth's oldest recorded civilization, raised a protest flag. The species has not engaged in hostility. There is no documented act of aggression. There doesn't need to be, Vorisen replied. The projections are consistent across 6 independent modeling systems. Within 40 cycles, 40 of their years, humanity will possess the capacity to challenge Council sovereignty over at least 2 cluster territories. Within 80 they may be capable of contesting more. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then Delegate Farath of the Mordai Syndicate, a civilization known for its bluntness, asked the question everyone else had been phrasing carefully around. Are we voting to eliminate them, or are we voting to authorize the preparation of elimination capacity? Vorisen's expression didn't change. We are voting to authorize both. The preparation begins immediately. The execution window is set at 18 months. Phoros registered formal dissent. 2 other delegates followed. 3 more abstained. But the motion passed. What the Council did not know, could not know, was that humanity had been listening. Not through intelligence operatives or intercepted communications. Not through any dramatic act of infiltration or cyber warfare. The method was far quieter than that and far more human in its origins. A graduate student in astrophysics at a university on the western coast of a mid-sized continent, running a passive signal analysis on background radiation patterns near Cara Secundus, had flagged an anomaly 14 months before the vote. She had written a paper on it. The paper had been peer-reviewed, published, flagged by 3 separate intelligence agencies, elevated through channels, assessed by a joint civilian-military science committee, and quietly handed to a woman named Director Lena Sorokina of the United Earth Coordination Directorate, an organization most humans didn't know existed. Director Sorokina had read the paper on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday she had convened the first closed session of what would become known internally as the Kareth Working Group. By Thursday she had begun making calls. The vote at the council had taken place on what, by Earth's reckoning, was a Friday afternoon in early autumn. Humanity had been preparing for 17 months by then. Before the alien fleet mobilized, Earth had already made its first move. The Kareth Working Group met for the first time in a facility that did not appear on any publicly accessible map. It was not a bunker in the traditional sense. No concrete walls, no blast doors sealed with dramatic theatrics. It was, in fact, a converted research annex attached to a deep space telemetry station in the highlands of Central Asia, chosen specifically because it was boring. The kind of building that attracted no attention because it looked like precisely what the cover story said it was. A relay and data processing facility for the Outer Solar Monitoring Network. Director Sorokina had learned, over the course of a long career in space policy and threat analysis, that conspicuous secrecy was its own kind of vulnerability. The first meeting had 7 attendees. By the 6th meeting there were 31. By the time the Galactic Council's vote was formally logged in the signal data, the working group had grown to encompass a carefully selected cross-section of humanity's most relevant expertise. Astrophysicists, propulsion engineers, military strategists, xenolinguists, materials scientists, and 2 historians whose specialty was the strategic analysis of asymmetric conflicts across human history. The historians had been Director Sorokina's idea. When a larger force decides to eliminate a smaller one, she had told her deputy at the time, the smaller force has 2 options. It can try to match the larger force directly, which is almost always a losing proposition. Or it can make the cost of elimination unacceptably high. She had paused. That's what we're going to do. The first strategic challenge the working group faced was not technological. It was psychological. They were working with incomplete information. The signal anomaly that had triggered the alert was compelling. The passive analysis had detected what appeared to be structured communication patterns in a frequency band no known human origin source used, but it was not a decoded transcript of a council vote. It was inference, built layer by careful layer from months of observation. They didn't know exactly what the council had decided. They had hypotheses, ranging from diplomatic contact protocols to trade restriction frameworks to, at the darker end of the analytical spectrum, something requiring a more urgent response. The xenolinguist team, working in parallel with a machine learning system trained on the structural properties of known non-human signal formats, a project that had itself been classified for the better part of a decade, had gradually assembled something that looked like a partial translation. The word they kept returning to, through 4 independent analytical pathways, did not have a clean equivalent in any human language. The closest rendering was a compound concept, something like removal from continuity of presence. In practical terms, it pointed in one direction. We're treating it as an extinction-level threat assessment, the lead xenolinguist, Dr. Yemi Adaora, told the group in a voice that was careful and controlled. That's not alarmism. That's what the structural analysis suggests. We could be wrong. But we cannot afford to act as if we might be right only after we've confirmed it. No one argued with her. The second challenge was one of scale, and it was humbling. The intelligence team had done its best to estimate Galactic Council capacity. The answer, even in conservative models, was staggering. Humanity had 17 extrasolar installations, roughly 200 functioning interstellar-capable vessels across all civilian and military registries combined, and a total off-world population numbering in the low tens of thousands. The Council represented 41 civilizations, the youngest of which was 800 years older than Earth's first written language, and the oldest of which had been spacefaring for longer than humanity had existed as a species. In a direct confrontation, the outcome was not in question. That framing, the working group agreed in its 4th session, was the wrong framing entirely. "We are not trying to win a war," said Admiral Casimir Brandt, the senior military representative, a man who had spent 30 years in deep space operations and had the particular calm of someone who had learned not to confuse composure with confidence. "We are trying to make a war not happen. Or, if it does happen, to survive it in sufficient condition that it cannot be finished." He pulled up a display showing a 3-dimensional map of human interstellar presence. 17 dots in the vastness of mapped space. Small, scattered, vulnerable in isolation. The first principle, he said, is dispersion. He gestured to a secondary layer on the map, not installations but potential installations. Systems that had been surveyed, assessed as viable, and then quietly set aside because the budget hadn't been there, or the political will, or the perceived urgency. We are going to finish what we started, he said. Quietly. Quickly. And in locations the Council's existing sensor coverage has the most difficulty resolving. The third challenge was the hardest, maintaining secrecy without sacrificing scale. The operation they were planning was not small. It involved redirecting significant portions of Earth's interstellar construction capacity, accelerating the development of several defense-related technologies that had been in slow-burn research phases for years, establishing new communication protocols designed to be robust against interference, and, most critically, beginning the quiet, careful process of dispersing elements of humanity's institutional knowledge, genetic archives, cultural records, and core engineering capability to locations that could, in theory, survive even the worst outcome. They were, in the most precise and unsentimental terms, preparing for the possibility that Earth itself might not survive. And they were doing it without telling anyone. The ethical weight of that decision sat heavily in the room. It was a historian, Dr. Benedetta Ferro, whose specialty was the survival strategies of besieged civilizations across human history, who articulated what others were struggling to say. Every civilization that has survived an existential threat has done something that looked, from the inside, like a betrayal of the values it was trying to protect. Secrecy. Sacrifice. Decisions made by a few on behalf of the many, without consent. She paused. History doesn't judge those decisions kindly when they fail. When they succeed, it calls them necessary. She looked around the room. Our job is to succeed. 18 months before the Council's strike window was set to open, the Kareth Working Group began its work in earnest. No announcements. No press conferences. No dramatic declarations. Just quiet, methodical, deeply serious human beings doing what humans had always done when the situation was genuinely dire. They got to work. Humanity's most dangerous move was the one no one saw coming. The freighter Endurance Meridian was not a remarkable vessel. She was 12 years old, flagged to a mid-tier commercial shipping consortium, and on paper she was carrying prefabricated modular habitat components to a mining survey installation in the outer reaches of the Kepler 442 system. A routine resupply run of the kind that happened dozens of times a year across humanity's modest constellation of extrasolar outposts. Her cargo manifest was accurate. Her flight path was filed through standard channels. Her crew of 19 had passed all the usual security and medical screenings. What the manifest did not list, because it had no category for it, was the sealed substrate vault bolted to the structural frame of Cargo Bay 7. Or the compressed data archive in the engineering compartment, built into the thermal insulation housing, containing a complete backup of the Human Genome Project, the entire digitized collection of the Library of Congress, 17 years of the Global Scientific Repository, and a sequential archive of Earth's major languages with full grammatical and contextual annotation. The Endurance Meridian was, functionally, a seed ship. She was one of 63. The dispersion strategy had emerged from a fundamental recognition. Humanity could not protect Earth by defending Earth alone. A civilization concentrated in a single system, however well armed, could be overwhelmed by a force large enough and determined enough. The math was not comforting. But a civilization spread across multiple star systems, with each node carrying the capacity to rebuild, to preserve knowledge, genetic diversity, cultural continuity, and the technical baseline needed to eventually restart industrial and scientific development, was a different problem to eliminate entirely. You couldn't kill what you couldn't find all of. And even if you found it, you couldn't kill what could reconstitute itself. This was the working group's most fundamental strategic insight, and it had come not from the military planners or the astrophysicists, but from Dr. Ferro's historical analysis. The civilizations that survived weren't the ones with the strongest walls, she had told the group. They were the ones that found ways to be somewhere else when the walls came down. She had shown them maps, diaspora patterns across human history, the way cultures had preserved themselves through dispersal, the way knowledge had survived not through fortification but through redundancy. The printing press, the oral tradition, the act of teaching, of ensuring that more than one person in more than one place knew the thing that needed to be known. Applied at interstellar scale, the principle became something both larger and more uncertain. But the principle held. The dispersion operation had 3 tiers. Tier 1 was the seed ships, vessels like the Endurance Meridian, carrying compressed archives, genetic material, and the technical knowledge needed to rebuild basic industrial capability from near scratch. 63 ships, dispatched over the course of 11 months through channels that looked, to any casual observer, like routine commercial traffic. They were headed to systems chosen not for their proximity to existing human infrastructure but for their obscurity: red dwarf systems, remote gas giant moons, a handful of survey installations so new they hadn't yet been officially registered with the Council's stellar cartography database. They were humanity's insurance policy. The most anyone could do to ensure that even a total loss at Earth did not mean a total loss of humanity. Tier 2 was the hardening of existing installations. The 17 extrasolar research outposts that humanity already operated were, in their current form, not defensible. They were science facilities, lightly staffed, optimized for observation and data collection with minimal self-sufficiency. They could not survive being cut off from Earth for more than a few months. The working group began changing that. Additional personnel were transferred out on the same commercial traffic flows that were carrying the seed ships. Researchers, engineers, medical staff, people with skills that would matter in a crisis. Additional supplies followed: fabrication equipment, food synthesis hardware, long-duration power generation systems, medical infrastructure. The cover story was a push toward greater operational independence for extrasolar facilities, framed as a cost reduction measure. It was plausible. It was, in the language of bureaucratic camouflage, boring enough to be unremarkable. It was also the most important construction project in human history. Tier 3 was the one that had taken the longest to plan and would take the longest to execute: the establishment of new installations in locations the Council did not know to look. This was the riskiest tier. Moving ships beyond known space, to systems that had been surveyed from afar but never visited, carrying the equipment needed to establish functional outposts, it required significant resources, careful timing, and the kind of operational security that depended less on technology than on human discipline. 14 new installations were planned. 8 had been established by the time this account enters the public record. Their locations remain classified. Alongside the dispersion effort, the working group's military planning team had been working on something more direct. Admiral Brandt had been clear from the beginning: dispersion was a survival strategy, not a deterrent strategy. It ensured continuity. It did not, by itself, create hesitation. Hesitation, he had said in one of the early sessions, is what we're actually trying to produce. We want whoever is making the decision on the other side to look at the cost-benefit analysis and decide that executing is not worth what it will cost them. The question was, what did the Council value enough that threatening it would produce hesitation? Not lives. In a conflict between a civilization with 41 member species and a single-system newcomer, casualties on the Council side would be trivial. Not territory. Humanity had no meaningful presence in any space the Council cared about. Not resources. Earth's strategic value to the Council was, in their calculus, probably close to zero. What humanity had, in abundance, was the one thing the Council had clearly found alarming enough to vote on: unpredictability. They had gotten further, faster than any model had projected. They had developed technologies that shouldn't, by developmental timeline standards, have been anywhere near mature. They had shown up, not when invited, not through guided contact, but on their own terms, by their own means, faster than expected. Unpredictability was uncomfortable. And uncomfortable was a lever. We need to demonstrate, Admiral Brandt said, that whatever they think they know about our capabilities is wrong. Not by showing them everything, but by making them uncertain that they know anything. The instrument for that demonstration was already under development. It had no official name in the working group's internal documentation. Personnel referred to it, in casual conversation, by a word that had come to feel fitting: the ambiguity. It was not a weapon system exactly. Or rather, it was not only a weapon system. It was a signal, one designed to be detected, partially decoded, and fundamentally misread. A communication that would tell the Council, without explicitly saying so, that humanity had capabilities it had not yet chosen to reveal. Whether that was entirely accurate was, in some interpretations, a matter of framing. In others, it was a calculated bluff of civilizational consequence. Director Sorokina, when asked by one of the junior analysts how comfortable she was with that ambiguity, had given an answer that would be quoted in later accounts of this period. "I'm comfortable with anything," she had said, "that keeps us alive long enough to make it true." Humanity sent one message into deep space. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. The signal left Earth on a Tuesday. It was transmitted from the Deep Space Array at Ganymede, the same installation whose data had first flagged the Council's deliberations to human attention. The array had been chosen for its power output. Among humanity's transmission infrastructure, it was the closest thing to a shout into the dark. The signal itself had been designed by a team of 9 people over the course of 4 months. It was not long. It was not complex. It was, by certain measurements, not even particularly sophisticated. What it was, and this had required 4 months of careful, agonizing calibration, was legible. Not to human senses but to the Council's monitoring systems. The signal was structured in a way that would, when processed through the translation matrices the working group had spent the better part of a year reverse engineering, resolve into something a Galactic Council analyst would interpret as a species-level strategic communication. The core of its content could be compressed into a few sentences of human language. We are aware that a decision has been made regarding our continued existence. We understand the reasoning. We would like to offer a different calculation. The response to the signal was not immediate. This had been anticipated. The Council's deliberative processes were, by their nature, slow, a feature, not a flaw, in an organization that had been managing interstellar relations for hundreds of thousands of years. Haste was the failure mode of young civilizations. The Council had learned that particular lesson many times over. But the signal had been received. The working group's monitoring systems confirmed that within 72 hours. And within 2 weeks, the Council's standard signal traffic near Cara Secundus had increased by a factor the analysts described, with admirable understatement, as notable. An emergency session had been called. Dr. Adaora, reviewing the partial intercepts, looked up from her terminal with an expression that was difficult to read. "They're surprised," she said. "Surprised that we know?" someone asked. "Surprised that we responded. I don't think they expected us to be capable of this kind of communication. Or," she paused, working through the inference carefully, "they didn't expect us to use it this way." What the Council's emergency session discussed, the working group would not know in full for several months. But the partial intercepts, assembled laboriously from fragmented signal data by Adaora's team, suggested something that the working group found both encouraging and sobering. The signal had done what it was designed to do. It had introduced doubt. Not doubt about the decision itself. Vorisen was not the kind of delegate who reversed her position easily, and the vote had been more decisive than the minority opposition had hoped. But doubt about the execution. About whether the projected timeline was still accurate. About what else humanity might have that the Council's models had failed to capture. One intercept fragment, partial, uncertain, translated through at least 2 layers of inference, suggested that at least one Council faction was arguing for delay pending reassessment. Another suggested that at least one faction was arguing for acceleration. Delay or acceleration. Hesitation or urgency. Those were, in their own way, both outcomes the working group could work with. They needed time. Even a week was something. A month was significant. 6 months was, potentially, transformative. The signal had been the visible part of the strategy. The part designed to be seen. What accompanied it, in the same transmission window but in a different frequency band entirely, one calibrated specifically for the Council's secondary monitoring systems, the ones designed to detect passive intelligence gathering rather than active communication, was something else. Not a message. A ghost. The working group's technical team had spent considerable effort modeling what the Council's passive sensor arrays would detect if there were, somewhere in the vicinity of Earth's solar system, a large-scale military mobilization underway. Not a real mobilization. Humanity didn't have the assets for that, not at the scale that would matter. But the signatures of one, power generation readings consistent with multiple vessels running high-output propulsion systems, material density anomalies in the outer system consistent with construction activity, communication traffic patterns matching what you'd expect from a coordinated fleet operation. None of it was real. All of it was generated. It was, in the language of the military planners, a noise floor operation, flooding the Council's sensors with ambiguous data that would require significant analytical resources to process and would, in processing, suggest the presence of capacity that didn't quite exist yet. The word, yet, was doing considerable work in that sentence. Admiral Brandt had presented the noise floor operation to the working group with his characteristic precision. He had also presented its risks, which were not small. If the Council's analysts were skilled enough, and there was every reason to believe they were, given the age and resources of the civilizations involved, they might see through the false signatures. Or they might recognize the technique itself as a bluff, which would tell them something about humanity's actual posture. Either outcome was worse than the signal alone. But the alternative, signaling awareness without any accompanying show of capacity, was, in Brandt's assessment, more dangerous. A message from a species with nothing to back it up is a curiosity, he had said. A message from a species that appears to have considerable assets in motion is a problem. We want to be a problem. Interesting enough to study. Costly enough to consider. And uncertain enough that certainty never quite arrives. The working group had voted on the noise floor operation. The vote was not unanimous. It passed. The second component of the signal strategy was quieter and, in some respects, more significant. While the Ganymede array transmitted the primary signal and the noise floor generators seeded the outer system with ambiguous signatures, a third transmission, very short, very precise, and directed not at the Council's main monitoring systems but at a specific set of secondary sensors the working group had identified as belonging to a Council faction that had voted against the motion, carried something different. Not a threat. Not a demonstration. A question. The translated content was approximately, "Are there those among you who would prefer a different outcome?" It was the first diplomatic communication humanity had ever directed at the Galactic Council. Dr. Farrow, when she heard what had been included, was quiet for a long moment. "That's the one that matters?" she said finally. "Why?" Director Sorokina asked. "Because it assumes they're not a monolith. Because it treats them as what they actually are, a collection of different interests, some of which might align with ours. That's not a signal to an enemy." She paused. "That's the beginning of a negotiation." The Council's emergency session lasted, by the working group's best estimate, several weeks. In that time, humanity's dispersion operations continued. Seed ships moved. Installations hardened. New outposts took their first cautious shape in the dark between stars. And in a frequency band that Dr. Adaora's team monitored around the clock, a reply was forming. When the Galactic Council responded to Earth, it said something no one expected. The reply was not what anyone had prepared for. Dr. Adaora had built 4 distinct response models in the weeks since the signal was sent, each representing a plausible Council posture. Model 1 was silence, no acknowledgement, a choice to proceed without engagement. Model 2 was a countersignal, structured in a way that communicated the Council's decision remained unchanged but noted the receipt. Model 3 was an accelerated threat signature, suggesting the signal had provoked rather than deterred. Model 4, the most optimistic, was some form of diplomatic acknowledgement, a signal that suggested, however tentatively, the opening of a channel. The reply that arrived was none of them. It came in 3 parts, separated by intervals the analysis team eventually concluded were deliberate, pacing in the Council's communication convention, that indicated not urgency but considered weight. Each part was addressed differently. The first to Earth's population broadly rendered in a signal format designed for mass-detectable reception. The second to the working group's specific transmission point at Ganymede, indicating that the source of the primary signal had been precisely located. And the third, the one that took Adaora's team the longest to decode, directed at the secondary frequency band, the one that had carried the diplomatic question. The first part of the reply was the most straightforward. Rendered into human language, its core content read: "The species designated Homo sapiens has demonstrated signal sophistication inconsistent with prior assessment. The Deliberative Council acknowledges receipt of communication. The status of proceedings regarding this species is under review pending additional data compilation." Which meant, in plain terms, the vote was not cancelled but the execution clock had been paused. That pause, indefinite in duration, contingent on the data compilation, was the first concrete outcome of everything the working group had built. It was not a victory. It was not safety. But it was time, and time was what everything else depended on. Director Sorokina read the translated text 3 times. Then she set it on the table in front of her and was quiet for almost a full minute. "How long?" she finally asked Adaora. "Depends on what they mean by additional data compilation. Could be weeks. Could be considerably longer." Adaora hesitated. There's a structural element in the phrasing that suggests the review was contentious. Not a clean consensus. Someone pushed for it, someone else pushed back. The faction that received the third signal? Possibly. We don't have enough to confirm. The second part of the reply was harder to parse and, in some ways, more unsettling. It was addressed directly to the Ganymede array, and its content was not a policy statement or a diplomatic formality. It was analytical, specific. It enumerated, in careful detail, several aspects of the primary signal that the Council's analysts had found unusual, not as accusations but as observations. As if a very old institution was taking the measure of something it had not encountered before and was doing so aloud, deliberately, for the benefit of whatever was listening. They had identified the noise floor operation. Not as a bluff, precisely. The language was more careful than that, but as a technique that did not match any known developmental profile for a species at humanity's stage. The implication was clear. They were noting the discrepancy. They were noting that something didn't add up. This was, the working group agreed in rapid session, both dangerous and potentially useful. Dangerous because it meant the council's analysts were better than the most conservative estimates had allowed for. The noise floor had not fooled them. If they concluded it was a deliberate deception rather than a genuine capability signal, the credibility of the entire communication strategy was in question. Potentially useful because, as Brandt noted, with the particular grimness of someone cataloging options rather than celebrating them, the fact that they couldn't quite account for it meant they couldn't dismiss it either. An unexplained anomaly, he said, is a problem for an intelligence analyst. They can't close the file. They can't write, bluff, disregard. They have to keep watching. Watching takes time. He looked around the table. We just bought ourselves more time. The third part of the reply was the one that changed everything. Adora's team spent 11 days on it. It was the shortest of the 3 transmissions and the most technically complex, layered in a signal structure that had clearly been designed to be readable only by whoever had sent the original diplomatic question. It used the same frequency band, the same structural conventions, and included what appeared to be a verification sequence derived from elements of humanity's own transmission, a kind of shared key. Whoever had sent it was not the Council as an institution. It was a faction within it, or, possibly, an individual delegate operating outside the institutional framework entirely. Its content, once fully decoded, was brief. Your question was received. There are those here who believe the calculation used to reach the current decision is based on an incomplete model. We do not speak officially. We speak because the incomplete model has made incomplete conclusions. If you wish to provide the data that is missing, and we believe you have it, there may be those here who can use it. It was signed, in a notation the Xenolinguist team identified as a personal rather than institutional marker, with a glyph they eventually associated with the Thaline Collective. For us, the delegate who had registered the first formal dissent. Director Sorokina had not slept properly in several weeks, which was not unusual for people running operations of this weight. She read Adora's translation of the third signal 4 times, then stood and walked to the window. The building had windows, actual ones, looking out onto the highland plateau, and watched the sky for a while. No one spoke. Finally she turned back. What data do we have that they think is missing? She asked. It was one of the historians who answered. Dr. Farrow had been reviewing the Council's threat assessments, reconstructed from the working group's intelligence work, for weeks, specifically looking for gaps. Their model doesn't account for variance correctly, she said. They've looked at our trajectory, our rate of development, our expansion speed, and modeled it as if it will continue on the same curve indefinitely. Exponentially. Like we're going to just keep accelerating forever. She pulled up a display. But that's not how human development actually works. We don't grow in smooth curves. We grow in surges and stalls, breakthroughs and setbacks. We nearly ended ourselves 4 times in the last 3 centuries. We came within a decade of catastrophic climate collapse. We had a complete breakdown of global institutional coherence in the 2030s that set large-scale space development back by almost 15 years. She pointed to the data. We're not a smooth exponential threat. We're chaotic, self-limiting, and deeply prone to destroying our own momentum. They're afraid of a version of us that doesn't quite exist. A long silence. They need to see the full picture, Director Sorokina said. Yes, Farrow said. Not just the accomplishments, the failures, the near misses, the actual shape of who we are. And you think that would change the calculation? Farrow considered. I think it would change a calculation. Enough to work with. She paused. Humans have always been most dangerous when we have something to lose. They're treating us like a threat because they see what we've built. They should also see what we've almost lost. Humanity's most powerful argument was its own history of almost failing. The document was called, in the working group's internal records, simply, the submission. It was not a military dossier. It was not a capabilities assessment or a threat profile or a diplomatic demand. It was something far harder to compile, and something that no civilization, to the Xenolinguist team's knowledge, had ever voluntarily presented to the Galactic Council before. It was a complete and unredacted account of humanity's failures. Not a confession, that framing would have been wrong. A failure in the relevant sense was not moral but developmental. The near extinctions, the civilizational near collapses, The moments when humanity's trajectory had bent sharply downward before, at great cost, bending back. The goal was not to appear weak. The goal was to present the thing the Council's model was missing: the self-corrective mechanism, the recursive capacity to recognize catastrophe in progress and sometimes not easily and sometimes at enormous cost, pull away from it. Dr. Farrow led the compilation. It was the hardest thing she had ever been asked to do professionally. Not because the research was difficult, the record was extensive, but because the act of assembling it required holding in mind, simultaneously, the full weight of what humanity had come close to losing and the full uncertainty of whether presenting that record would help or harm. The submission was organized into 6 thematic sections. Section 1 covered existential risk events with anthropogenic origin, the climate inflection period of the mid-21st century, which had come within measurable distance of triggering cascading feedback effects that no reasonable model could have recovered from without massive civilizational disruption. The global governance crisis of the 2030s, in which the collapse of several major international frameworks had, for roughly 11 years, left humanity without effective coordination. Mechanisms for managing shared threats. The biosafety failures of the late 21st century, including 2 events that had required total global quarantine protocols and had resulted in population reductions that were, in demographic terms, significant. The section did not minimize. It presented the data, the decision points, the choices made and not made, the mechanisms by which collapse had been avoided. Section 2 covered the technological failures, the development pathways that had been explored and abandoned, the engineering disasters, the projects that had seemed like breakthroughs and had turned out to be dead ends. The fusion program that had absorbed enormous resources for 40 years before producing a workable design. The early interstellar propulsion efforts that had killed 3 crews before the underlying physics were better understood. The quantum communication projects that still had not produced a reliable working system, despite 2 decades of serious investment. This section was, in some ways, the most counterintuitive to include. The military planners had argued against it, showing failures in advanced technology development could look like weakness to an adversary. But Farrow's counterargument had been ultimately persuasive. The Council's models were treating humanity as a smooth exponential threat. Evidence of genuine, costly, time-consuming failure in technical development was evidence of a species that was not invincible and knew it. Section 3 covered the social and political record. The long, unfinished project of building institutions capable of managing a species of 8 billion individuals with deeply diverse interests and values. It was not a flattering section. It included the collapses, the conflicts, the periods of catastrophic institutional failure. It also included the recoveries, the ways in which humans had repeatedly found mechanisms to rebuild cooperation after breakdown. The point was not that humanity was noble. The point was that humanity was complicated. Not a monolithic threat, but a species in the middle of an ongoing project it had not finished. One that could still fail in ways that required no help from outside. Section 4 was the scientific record. Not the achievements but the methodology. The way human science had learned to correct itself. Peer review. Replication crises and their resolutions. The long history of paradigm shifts in which prevailing theories had been overturned by evidence. The humility built, painfully, into the scientific process itself. Section 5 was the one Farrow had spent the most time on. It was titled, in her internal drafts, The Threshold Behavior. The ways humanity had pulled back from the edge at moments when continuation seemed more likely than reversal. The social movements that had changed trajectories. The policy frameworks that had, despite everything, managed to redirect momentum. The specific institutional mechanisms, some centuries old, some recent, that existed precisely to catch the civilization before it destroyed itself. Section 6 was the shortest. It contained a single argument, stated directly. We are not the threat your models project. We are the species that your models have not yet accounted for. One that builds toward the stars while simultaneously trying, not always succeeding but genuinely trying, not to burn the ground beneath us. The danger we represent is not the danger of an empire expanding without limit. It is the danger of a species still learning what it is. We ask not for immunity. We ask for the opportunity to be correctly understood. The submission was transmitted to Faraz's faction through the channel the third signal had established. The transmission window was narrow. The working group's monitoring suggested a period of approximately 72 hours in which the Council's secondary sensor coverage would be concentrated in a different sector, reducing the risk of the communication being detected by factions not meant to receive it. Ada managed the transmission personally. She sat in the communications room at Ganymede watching the data stream, and when it was finished she sat very still for a while. "Do you think they'll listen?" one of the junior analysts asked. She thought about it. "I think Foras will read it," she said. "Whether that's enough depends on things we can't see from here." While the submission was in transit, the dispersion operations continued. Seed Ship 44, the Anatolian Passage, completed its journey to a surveyed but unnamed system 47 light-years from Earth and began the slow process of establishing its installation. Its crew of 23, scientists, engineers, a physician and a teacher, unpacked their equipment in the cold light of a star that had no name in any human catalog, just a catalog number and a set of spectral characteristics. Installation Kareth 9, named quietly and without irony, for the red dwarf around which humanity's fate had been deliberated, received its final supply delivery and went to full operational status. Its 41 personnel, chosen for the particular combination of skills and temperament required for indefinite self-sufficient operation, received the news about the submission with a reaction that the installation commander described in her log as careful hope. Admiral Brandt, reviewing the overall operational status in the working group's weekly summary, used a phrase that would later be quoted in several historical accounts of this period. "We have made ourselves harder to finish. Now we need to make ourselves worth starting over with." 14 days after the submission was transmitted, the monitoring system at Ganymede detected a change in Council signal traffic. Not a reply, not yet. But a change in pattern. The emergency session frequency had decreased. The anomalous traffic near Kareth Secundus, which had been elevated since the original signal exchange, was showing something different now, not the churn of a body reacting to a crisis, but the slower rhythm of deliberation. Adaora's translation assessment read, "Reassessment in progress. Timeline of original motion extended pending review of new material." What the Galactic Council did next changed everything, but not the way anyone expected. The formal response arrived 41 days after the submission. It came not through the secondary channel, the quiet line to Faras's faction, but through the primary frequency that the Council used for official intercivilization communications, which meant it was, by Council convention, a statement of institutional record. Something that had been agreed, deliberated, and was now part of the formal ledger of galactic deliberative history. Adaora read the first decoded lines and didn't speak for a long moment. Then she called Director Sorokina. The Council's response had 4 components. The first was a formal suspension of the motion regarding Homo sapiens. Not a reversal, the language was careful on this point. The original threat assessment remained in the Council's active files. The vote was not expunged. But the suspension was indefinite, contingent on a set of conditions that would be revisited at regular intervals. In practical terms, the execution window had been closed. The second component was something that had, to Adaora's knowledge, been offered to only 3 other civilizations in recorded Council history, a monitoring accord. Under its terms, the Council would maintain passive observation of human development across a defined set of indicators. Humanity would, in return, provide regular voluntary reports to the Council, reports that could include developmental data, scientific progress, and notably, any further crisis events of civilizational significance. They were being asked, in effect, to continue submitting the full record, to make transparency a formal practice rather than a one-time diplomatic gambit. The third component was the one that surprised everyone in the working group, including Director Sorokina, an invitation. Not to full Council membership. That was a process requiring assessments spanning decades, and the language made clear the Council was not committing to any particular outcome, but to observer status, to attendance at open Council sessions, to the beginning, formal and cautious and heavily conditioned, of a relationship. The fourth component was brief and addressed specifically to the secondary channel, to whatever human parties had transmitted the diplomatic question that had reached Faras's faction. It was personal in tone, in a way that institutional Council communications rarely were. It read approximately, "The document you provided has been reviewed by multiple delegations. The model correction you proposed has been acknowledged as materially significant by the body responsible for the original assessment. This outcome is not assured to be permanent. Development continues to be monitored. But the history you provided, the failures as much as the achievements, has been noted. The vote was based on a species that was not fully described. A more complete description has altered the calculation. It was signed with Faras's glyph." Director Sorokina read the full translation 3 times. Then she read the last paragraph twice more. The room was quiet. The working group had been operating in continuous session, in various configurations, for 21 months. They had dispersed 63 seed ships to locations scattered across a volume of space no single adversary could easily enumerate. They had hardened 17 installations and built 8 new ones. They had developed signal capacities that didn't exist at the beginning of the process, forged an intelligence picture of the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, and transmitted the single most comprehensive account of human failure ever compiled, as a diplomatic instrument. And they had not been eliminated. Not because they had matched the Council's power. They hadn't. The disparity in scale and resources between humanity and the Galactic Deliberative Council remained what it had always been: enormous. They had survived because they had made the cost of elimination uncertain, made the alternative to elimination imaginable, and made themselves, in the fullest, least flattering, most accurate sense they could manage, known. Admiral Brandt, at the final full session of the Kareth Working Group, said something that became, in the years that followed, something close to a description of the period. We did not win. That framing is wrong. The Council still has the capacity to revisit this, and they will be watching us for the rest of our civilization's life. What we did was make it possible for there to be a rest of our civilization's life. The work of justifying that possibility, the work of actually becoming what we argued we were, that begins now. And it doesn't end. He paused. The people in this room should know, the history we submitted included every near miss, every collapse, every failure. We told them we were chaotic and self-limiting and still learning. That's what got us here. A quiet beat. Now we have to keep being honest about that. With them. And with ourselves. The monitoring accord was signed 18 months later, by representatives of the United Earth Coordination Directorate and 3 Council delegates, including Foros. The ceremony was not public. There were no photographs, no speeches for domestic audiences, no diplomatic theater. It happened in a small chamber aboard a Council vessel that had been permitted, for the first time in history, to enter Earth's solar system and assume a stable orbit at the edge of the heliopause. Dr. Ada Ora attended as part of the human delegation. She had spent 23 months translating the signals that had made the meeting possible. Now she sat in a room with beings whose civilizations had been old before humanity learned to write, watching 2 signatures go onto a document that would, in the Council's archives, be filed under a category she could finally translate clearly. Civilizations under active observation, assessed non-imminent. Not safe. Not accepted. Not equals. Not finished. But here. Still here. The seed ships were not recalled. The installations remained hardened. The dispersion strategy remained in place, maintained by a small permanent office that reported to the Coordination Directorate through classified channels. Director Sorokina, in her final briefing to the working group before it was formally dissolved and its functions absorbed into standing institutional structures, had been precise about why. The accord is real, she said. Faras's goodwill is real. The Council's reassessment was real. None of that changes the underlying reality: we are 1 vote away from a different outcome. 1 change in Council composition. 1 human crisis bad enough to confirm their original model. She looked around the room. We built the architecture we built because we could not depend on being understood correctly. That architecture stays. It is not a sign of distrust. It is the most honest thing we can offer them. Proof that we take this seriously. That we intend to still be here, still accountable to this accord, 100 years from now. She paused. That's not defiance. That's a promise. Somewhere 47 light-years from Earth, in the cold light of a nameless star, the crew of the Anatolian Passage continued their work. They had received the news about the accord through a 2-day-old transmission. They had gathered in the installation's common room, 23 people in a small heated structure on a world no human had seen before, and the teacher among them had explained it to the 2 children who had been born since the voyage began. What the Council was, what the accord meant, why it mattered. The children were 3 and 1. They would never know a version of humanity's future that did not include the knowledge of what was out there. That, in some ways, was the point. The future would be different because the architecture had been built. Not because humanity had been powerful enough to demand a different outcome, but because it had been honest enough, careful enough, and, in the end, stubborn enough to survive the moment when surviving required something more than force. Something closer to truth.